Oh, I have to say, got it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's a demotic software. It has no manners. But so
I
we are recording now, I believe. So and with any luck, the recording will be good enough that we'll be able to use it. But if not, it's good to see you.
and to see you after many interesting communications by email.
Yeah. Uh, over it as it turns out, over 100 odd. I went back over them looking for material for our conversation and realized that we've exchanged too many comments from me. So I just have to work from memory here. But anyway, you are, so just for those watching this who may not know, Salley Vickers, and esteemed, wonderful novelist, whose name is in fact Salley,
Hmm.
because your parents named you. You say I almost hesitate to that because I almost broke into singing down by the Salley Gardens as a sort
Oh,
of
please do.
introduction. Nah, I lost my voice years ago, but I could try. Down by the Salley Gardens, my love and I did meet. And if we had more than 90.
Bravo.
Yeah, well, yeah, but before the lung problems, I could really belt these things out. And not like an Irish tenor, but maybe like an Irish baritone who'd had a bit too much to drink. So, how are you?
Um, I'm well, despite the malaise that is the British Isles.
Well,
I'm certainly well.
you've just celebrated a birthday, your 47th, I believe.
I think for the sake of the sake of your audience, we should explain that my granddaughter kindly reverses the numerals in my age. So you can work out for yourselves what 47 means. But
All right.
alas, 47 was a long way back for me.
I would never know. I'd never know to see you. So,
Charmer.
yeah, well, I tried it. Well, I'm rarely called that, but sometimes I can make an effort. So, um, I've been doing these conversations uh, mostly just to change the format for my Substack page. But this one I've been looking forward to especially because the thing that I've noticed, well, not that I've noticed, something that's emerged from our exchanges over email is are several convergences of sensibility, and I like to think wholesome prejudices uh, regarding good art, bad art, silly things, and a shared passion also for children's literature. But
Particularly.
but before any of that, I just have to say I pulled out my copies of novels of yours I have, and I discovered I have 16
Wow.
here. Now, well, they're not all novels. Two of them are your short stories collections. The Boy Who Could See Death, which is, I think, your favorite of your short stories, and Aphrodite's Hat. And then, of
It's not
course,
quite, sorry, I'm going to interrupt. It's not quite my favorite. My favorite of my stories is The Indian Child, which concerns the little changeling boy
oh,
who
oh right,
appears in Midsummer Night's Dream,
right. No,
which is
that's a bit.
perhaps relevant to our possible conversation.
Yes, because I plan to talk about fairies. Might as well
Exactly.
give away the plot now. I mean,
That's why I'm here.
but your latest book, I might as well do the meretricious thing and try to sell your latest. Well, I have two copies of it, but I'll show this one, The Gardener.
That's the best one. That's the hardback. And why is it best? Because it was designed by myself and Naman, who is kindly taking care of the technology of this for me.
I, I love these hardcover editions that the Penguins put out of this, and you sent me the Librarian too. I already had a copy of it. Actually, I should clarify my hard copy of Where Three Roads Meet isn't really mine. It's Roland's. You sent it to him, but I don't think he minds if I don't think he'll mind if I claim it along with the others for now.
He's a generous.
He's generous. He's wise. He's
And very well read.
a little bit acerbic, I have to say, and perhaps he has some of the prejudices that his species is known for. You know, certain doubts regarding.
Bit of a cynic, perhaps.
Yeah, well, that's an obvious joke, isn't it? I mean,
I'm so
you know,
sorry.
it's
It's
not.
one you make yourself, though, in Roland by Moonlight.
This is right. This is true. Although, again, I don't like to take credit for any of it because you know I still believe that those conversations really took place. I can't prove it. I can't document when or where, but I don't feel that I'm the sole author of that work. So.
Certainly not.
So how many? Can I ask? I should have counted up before I asked you how many novels have you published? How many collections of short stories now? Is it about that 18? Am I right?
No,
20?
you've kindly exaggerated my output, which
Oh.
I'm very.
Or maybe I'm the one who's written 18 books. Sorry.
I think you've probably written 18
Okay.
books. I think I've written. Actually, I don't think I can quite. I think I've written 12 and two.
Then how
two
could I have
volumes of
16 here?
stories.
Maybe I'm not very good at counting. Of course, two of the books I have in 2 copies each because you sent me also a nice edition of the library. All right. Well, by my count, it looks like more, but I'm not going to go and heap them up in my lap now. But anyway, I'll say this: they're all delightful, all the ones I've read, and you're one of the few novelists out there of whom I can say I've never suffered any sense of langueur in reading any of your books. They all seem to put me in a good state of mind, even the ones that aren't necessarily. I mean, so I mean, you know, how can I put it? Even those that are a little graver somehow leave me with a sense of elevation of spirit, and I think I first became aware of your novels back when the first one came out, Miss Garnett's Angel, which was what 21 years ago, was it 2001?
It was actually published in 2000 here.
2000, all right.
2001 in the States. Yeah.
Yeah, and to bring this something full circle, one of our conversations, one of the reasons I picked it up is I saw that it was recommended by Penelope Fitzgerald. And you and I recently had an exchange on how much you love Penelope Fitzgerald's books, and I went back to them at your recommendation, having and reread Gate of Angels and The Blue Flower, which are wonderful novels, and so they're magnificent. Especially like Gate of Angels because, as I told you, I thought it would have made an excellent Ernst Lubitsch comedy if the time had been right. But your book, your most recent book, The Gardener, is also I think was my favorite novel this past year that I read, in part because of the things that apparently your editors and some of your critics don't seem to have noticed in the book. Most conspicuously, the presence of fairies, who, while I admit, I mean, you don't go into great long discourses on the nature of these moments and these apparitions or these experiences, I thought were fairly conspicuous part of the narrative and part of the plot, but apparently it's possible to read over them.
Yes, I have found over the years in Miss Garnett's Angel, which was my first novel, and I was very lucky with that novel. It was my first novel, and I was very lucky to get it. A very receptive public. the Archangel Raphael, who appears out of the story of Tobias and the Angel, which protagonist first sees in one of Venice's beautiful churches in a series of paintings by one of the Guardi brothers. Raphael appears quite conspicuously throughout the narrative. But in other of my books, that's my email pinging when it shouldn't. But in other of my books,
it's local color.
The element that perhaps we might say is occupied by the Archangel Raphael in Miss Garnet's Angel is less palpable, is less obviously discernible. And in this particular book, I wanted to write about a part of England which has a long and ancient history. Well, I suppose all parts of England do, as indeed all parts of the world do, but retains that ancient history in forms of ancient springs, ancient wells, ancient monuments, and ancient holy places. Where it turns out that before the Christians arrived and changed our culture for a long time, there was a very powerful and lively pagan worship. And it's a part of the world, it's the Welsh Marches, the borderland between England and Wales, where I've lived, so I know it well. I never write about a place with which I'm not intimately familiar. I mean, I regard that as the most important thing. If you're going to write about the metaphysical, I think you have to get the physical as accurate and as established as you possibly can. Otherwise, people are simply not going to believe you. They probably won't anyway. But I became very interested in these pagan places that were taken over, in fact, by the early Christian saints after the Romans left and a different way of life became established. And I think that, and my long years of teaching Shakespeare, and my love of Midsummer Night's Dream, and my love of Spenser's The Faerie Queene, and my love of Puck of Pook's Hill by Kipling, reactivated my latent and dormant, but never eradicated interest in fairies, or the hidden people, or the other people, or however you want to talk about them. And so I introduced them into this novel. But what was so interesting is that although they are really the heart of the novel, where something occurs, which is, it's not taken from any actual fairy tale, but it's in the provenance of fairy telling, where something happens in a wild place that has a life-changing effect.
Well, it's sort of the axis of the narrative,
it is.
Which is why I find it strange that someone could fail to notice what's going on.
Well, the thing is, I don't actually spell it out, you see.
Yes.
And this, of course, is the great problem, because if you spell things out, your percipient reader, such as yourself, and the kind of reader I really want to have, says, why the hell is she spelling it out? Does she think I'm stupid? If you don't spell it out, people don't see it. So I have had a number of people writing in on Amazon saying, you know, lovely book, interesting book about nature and England and two sisters who don't get on and then do get on. But what the hell's happening in the middle of the book? Why has it got this funny ending? And of course, the ending is a magical ending. But I leave it to the reader and the reader's imagination to create the story of what happened, because I don't exactly know what happened.
Right. Well, even
at Garnet's Angel. Sorry, I was just. I don't.
I'm sorry that we're getting the delay, the transatlantic delay. Sorry, I'll shut up for a second. Let you finish.
I was just saying, at the end of Miss Garnet's Angel, Miss Garnet walks across a bridge to somewhere, and it isn't clear where she's going and what's happening to her. And I've left that to the readers to make out for themselves. I do the same thing in The Gardener, because I think you should trust your readers. Yeah. But it's because I feel, and I know we agree about this, but it's probably worth us spelling it out, that the imagination of both the writer and the reader acts upon whatever we call reality and is itself creative. So the reader is creating an imaginal world out of my book as he or she is reading it. And that doesn't always happen, because I think we are unused to exercising our imagination upon the world in the ways that we used to do before the so-called Enlightenment, she said, introducing a rather large topic. Taking a swig of drink.
and with a hint, just a hint of asperity in your voice there, you know. But
well, asperity is unknown to me.
Yeah, no, you know, sweet as can be down by the Salley Gardens. You would never be sardonic, I know, but the thing, of course, I love the very formulation that the reader creates an imaginal world in the act of reading. This is a curious aspect about the entire modern approach. Well, maybe the modern approach to everything, you know, sort of positivistic approach to experience, but to literature and the arts, is the notion that one's encountering a fixed artifact whose principal interest is that it's authentic, that is, that it comes from this particular artist, and whose content is an act on the part of that artist simply to communicate things in a propositional way. Whereas we, at least judging from the philosophical and religious commentaries on the literature of the antique past, of the ancient world, no one thought of reading that way.
No.
The act of reading itself was an inspired process. Interpretation was part of the creative act, and it's a curious. I mean, obviously, this comes up in theological history, and you know, the transition, that dreadful moment that we call the Enlightenment. But rather, the transition from ancient and medieval habits of reading to modernity, this habit of treating, say, the Bible, obviously the Bible, as a text containing either immutable oracles delivered from the lips of God, or propositional content that you either affirm or reject. But up until that threshold was crossed, the act of reading was always understood as something that almost of necessity, if the text was worth your time, that is, required reading per allegoriam, required reading it as also the occasion of a creative act on the part of the reader. And so, yes, no, I mean, I appreciate, I would have hated it if you had spelled out exactly what happened that night. That's all I'll say for those who haven't read the book. I would have hated that. You're right. As it was, there's a wonderful, there's not only a wonderful air of mystery about that scene, that, you know, it's something, I'll just say that something that's sort of between waking and dreamlike consciousness, the way it's described, very beautifully described. But at the end, you're left with a mystery. On the one hand, there's a perfectly natural explanation, but on the other hand, there's a surfeit beyond the natural that clings to the, and you're just left with it. And I think that's, well, anyway, I found the book captivating, and also because you told me that you stole a line from me. I
did.
To throw in an advertisement for myself.
I did, and the trouble is, you know, David, I don't have a copy of my own book here, but perhaps you do, and you will know the line. I give it to Miss Foote.
Well, the problem is I don't. I remember when you told me where it came from, but it was from...
Well, it's a line that from a conversation you had with your son, and it's in one of your books of essays, and it's a moment when he looks at a beautiful autumnal wood and says, you can see why in the ancient days people used to think there were dryads and sprites in the wood, and you're horrified. And you say, what makes you think that there are no dryads and sprites in the wood? you say something which, unfortunately, although I've stolen it from you, and given it and delivered it into the mouth of Miss Foote, who I probably speaks for both
It's
of us.
it's always I've got to make a
It's
joke here
okay.
about foot and mouth and foot. Anyway, so here we go.
Sorry, yes. Um, the essence, although can't quote you or her word for word, is that the sprites and spirits existed in the wood long before the Christians came, but they haven't gone. They're just hiding. And I think it's that liminal world of the world that exists between the human being and the natural world is, I think, the world that throughout history up until very recently, and recently in the works of the rather crude works of Walt Disney, is occupied by these presences that operate between, well, I think they have an ontological reality. So it's a question of discerning other levels of reality than the quotidian material reality that is what we seem nowadays to be stuck with, to our great loss, a diminished world. And it was, I stole your line quite openly. I mean, I didn't even imagine I'd made it up for myself, because it so exactly represented what I wanted Miss Foote to say. And you said it for her better than I did. But I did own up.
Okay, so but I think I've come up with the joke. It's something about having put Miss Foot in my mouth or something. But I'm still working on it. But anyway, I'm very flattered. But it's also true that I share your conviction that we're talking about a real dimension of existence and experience. In fact, I think, in a sense, classical Christian metaphysics sort of requires a notion of the presence of living consciousness throughout the natural order. Simply, the traditional logos metaphysics of Christian thought is not, too long. And this is part of post-Reformation consciousness, but I can't put all the burden on the Protestants or the counter-reformers. Or there's a sort of disenchantment that robs the world not only of its metaphysical depth, but robs it of the sort of the coherence of believing that this is the manifestation of divine mind, but also that actually makes comprehensible the presence of human consciousness in nature. I'm working now, finishing up a book on the philosophy of mind for Yale, which is very late in being finished for any number of reasons, mostly the COVID shutdown. And I think what's interesting is more and more the philosophy of consciousness at present is moving almost inexorably towards embracing forms of panpsychism. I think in a naive way, in a crude way at times, but because more and more there's a realization that either consciousness is an anomaly within a mechanistic universe, in which case it's inexplicable because the causal narrative between that mechanistic order and what consciousness clearly is cannot be told, cannot even be imagined, and probably cannot actually really exist. Or they're going to have to you're going to have to accept that consciousness itself is intrinsic to the structure of the universe, to the reality of nature. And if that's so, then it may be the fact that a world that perceived or thought in terms of dryads and naiads and nereids, or Kama and Tami, or Manitou, is one that's a more rational picture of reality than the sort of barren mechanistic picture of nature we work with now.
Well, I think I've been in conversation with Ian McGilchrist,
Right.
who's picture of the universe is very, very similar. That in fact there's consciousness in every, just because a number of people have, investigated the ways, for example, in which trees communicate.
Right.
Trees
And in very, and in
look
very,
after themselves. And so it seems to make sense that I mean, I think the problem with fairies and elves and so on and so forth is that they have got squeezed into a rather vulgar image, which involves tinsel wings and pink frocks and pointy hats and so on and so forth. And of course, our human imagination tends to be limited by what has been imagined before. We don't have very sophisticated images for these presences. But it seems to me that more and more the way in which nature works and speaks in ways that have been hitherto uncharted by us bears out the fact that throughout history, civilizations have believed in nature spirits of some kind or another.
Oh. Well, this is, one of my friends, John Milbank, when he briefly taught in the States for a while, was very adamant that the problem with America was that there were no fairies here, and I had to disabuse him of this and to point out to him that there were people here before the Europeans arrived, and all of them have stories of the hidden people or the small or the little people. My part of well, actually, I have an anecdote to relate that I've never publicly divulged before, but I'm wait to get to that regarding them. But it's a universal reality of human culture, and it's interesting how clear the similarities are. I think, though, one of the things, and again, I didn't plan just to keep lavishing praise on you, but I'm sure you won't object.
I don't object.
Yes.
Please feel free. It's rare enough.
Well, there's an approach to. I should explain to those who may not be familiar with your fiction that when you talk about the pre-Christian world, this isn't meant as some sort of trite anti-Christian diatribe on the part of no, that in fact that it's all there. What I like about your books, especially aside from the fact I like the voice, I like the stories, I like the characters, but I put my finger on it just recently, is that there's an approach to questions of mystery and the sacred that I find intensely unattractive. And one author you and I have never discussed at all, so I don't know how you feel about it, but my example would be the serious, the religious novels of Graham Greene. Which right, oh good. So once again, we're in agreement here. I just
put me off for life. End of the Affairs. Awful book.
Oh God, yeah, I know. And have you ever seen the dreary movie with Deborah Carr and Van Johnson? It's just as bad as the book. So, but I love Deborah Carr, so I sat through it once. I'll never do it again. But the power and the glory is that the whiskey priest and all that. I understand what's going on there. In a sense, it's rather like that picture of nature and grace that I rejected in the recent book Your Gods, which I don't know if I think you said you had read it or were going to read it, but whatever the case,
I love it. I think it's one of your best books. But anyway, go on.
Oh well, thank you. The picture, the wrestling with grace in which there is, this world, and then there's the order of grace that, in a sense, descends upon, manifests itself in the life. I understand the spirituality there, but it also it has that unpleasant sort of modern manualist Thomist feel of grace always being an invasion of an otherwise spiritually barren reality through which. Now, and this is not a criticism of Graham Greene as such. I don't like those novels. I like his entertainments, Stamboul Train and the one with his aunt, and those.
It travels with my aunt. Yes.
Yeah, travels with my aunt. I enjoy that, but in your books, there's a more, and part of it's a kind of I don't know, instinctive Anglicanism or. But an older sort of Catholic vision in the fuller sense that your books reflect to be the principium plenitudinis, the great chain of being, is that the natural, the preternatural, the angelic, the supernatural, the divine, seem to be present all in their own modes in a kind of continuum.
Well, I'm very flattered and honoured to hear you say that. I don't think I ever set out to write consciously about those things, but I would say that I think I'm conscious of all in my own experience of life. And I think as time has gone on, I think the sense of the interfusion of these different aspects of reality is really what's preoccupied me, and I think it's really what got me writing novels. I'm a fantastically lazy person.
Good. All good writers are, except of course Trollope.
But I think what finally impelled me to write was I grew up in a strictly atheist household. It was a very good socialist, socially committed household. Socialist in England is not quite the terrifyingly dangerous political position as it is.
I don't know about
that. I hasten to say they were communists, they were atheists. The only book that my father would never buy me was a Bible. Consequently, of course, I became very fascinated by the Bible. But what I noticed in myself was that I grew up with a kind of instinctive religious feeling, which was initially towards trees and flowers and plants and birds, which is probably the latest expression of that is the gardener, because the principal setting is a garden. And I think I wrote Miss Garnet's Angel because the principal character, Miss Garnet, starts the story. She's elderly, she's retired. She's also a committed socialist and a strict atheist. And her way of looking at the world is broken apart, partly through art and the experience of looking at the wonderful art that you can find in Venice, which happens to be a place I know rather well. Also partly through falling in love with an unsuitable recipient who turns out to be homosexual and actually more interested in the young boy she's befriended. But it leads through into her rediscovery of the widening power of the religious view. And I wrote that, I suspect, both out of my experience of Venice and my very great love of art. Art appears in a lot of my novels.
Yeah.
Also, I think because I was, in a way, not exactly mourning, but I suppose it was a feeling of what my parents had missed in a wider, more animate vision of the universe. I mean, they were incredibly good people, and I'm incredibly grateful to them in lots and lots of ways. But that whole dimension was missing, and I had to carry it around in secret. So nobody taught me about religion. It was implicit. And I have a feeling, though lots of people are going to disagree, that it's inherent in all children
No.
I mean, there probably are exceptions. I think it's part of the human psyche that we have a religious disposition. And whether it expresses it through Hinduism or Buddhism or Judaism or Christianity or paganism, it doesn't matter. It's some sense that we are not the sum of everything and that the world is a deeply mysterious and wonderful place. And we are given an imagination to look into the life of things and have that beauty revealed to us. And really, that's what all my books are about, the revelation of a deep and hidden beauty at the heart of things. It takes different forms, but really, I
Oh.
write the same book again and again, being, as I say, rather lazy.
It's not uncommon, though. I mean, I think if I most well, I mean, there are some cases in which it's almost obsessive, like Patrick Modiano keeps writing literally the same novel over and over again. But in a broader sense, though, I think most artists have a certain world of themes and images that they work variations on again and again and again, and it's in a sense their garden, their special land, their plot to till. But yeah, you mentioned, since you brought up what is natural to us psychologically or spiritually, or some of those watching or listening to this may not know that actually, in a sense, being a novelist was sort of a second career for you, right? I
Third.
mean,
It was a
third,
third career.
third career. All right. So, well, um, uh, because, well, I mean, apparently, when you wrote Miss Garnet's Angel, it got accepted and it immediately got recognized as a wonderful novel and all that. But before that, you'd been a therapist, right, and a teacher of English literature or world literature. I can't recall.
A bit of both. I taught a lot of world literature when I was working in adult education, but I also taught university students, including students from Berkeley, who came over for a semester in Oxford, where I taught Shakespeare. Then I trained as a Jungian analyst, and I mean, I am no longer a great devotee of Jung, although there's much in his psychology that I still
Yeah.
admire and respect. And it was really only when I wrote Miss Garnet's Angel, and it turned out to be a surprise success, that I finally took the plunge to become a writer, which was a gamble, but mostly has paid off. But I mean, Jung, although, as I say, I have many disagreements with Jung. I think, to his great credit, he did, unlike Freud, who I admire as a person, although I don't agree with his psychology, Jung did very much believe that the human psyche had an important religious dimension. And he often said that it was his task to return people to a religious state of mind, by which he did not mean going to church or saying prayers, or not that he was particularly against those things, but a religious point of view about what it means to be a human being. And for that, I am very grateful. I think that working in that tradition and working a lot with people's dreams and the symbolism of people's dreams has certainly interpenetrated my writing as a novelist.
Actually, I wanted to, since you again mentioned dreams, this is a curious thing. I actually put great stock in dreams myself, never having known exactly why, but in my poor dabblings in fiction, a great number of the stories seem to be about people's dreams. but the curious thing is, I've had dreams at times that have become stories that
Mm.
only afterwards, with the help of others, I was able to understand. Talk about readers being interpreters. I think two stories I sent you, I believe, or that we've talked about. One short one called "The True Helen," and one called
House of Apollo.
The House of Apollo." Both were
Wonderful
dreams.
stories. Wonderful
Yeah.
stories.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Oh, I think so, but I would think so anyway. Luckily, I don't suffer from any excessive humility. So, but the curious thing is they were both very, very vivid dreams.
Mm.
They had to be turned into stories. I mean, the dreams obviously lack. There's a certain fluidity of detail in any dream, but they weren't like other dreams. And there's a third story like that as well. That it's a collection I'm writing now, and I was certain. And I don't think this is just true of things you dream up. I would just think in general, if you're writing, well, that that it was that they were gifts in some sense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so I didn't really resent it when someone else explained them to me better than I could explain them to myself. Or like the House of Apollo ends with an image that clearly echoes the image of Moses seeing God being placed in the cleft of the rock and seeing God pass by and all his kavod, his beauty or his sublime beautifulness, or however you, or actually I have to check the Hebrew. I think it's kavod there, not yofi, but a check. But I hadn't actually seen it until my nephew pointed it out to me. I think that's true, or maybe I'd said. And I've always found this one of the more uncanny experiences, because I know what I'm doing for myself if I write an essay or an academic work, and I know how I'm getting from point A to point B. But there's a different kind of writing, a different kind of creativity, where it seems to me clearly the case that one is receiving as much as one's, generating. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's your experience. I feel that way with some of your books too. Actually, before you sent me The Gardener and I read it, the book of yours I'd most recently read was the Cleaner of Chartres. And I love the character of Agnès in it. There's a scene in that book, though, where she's in the cathedral at Chartres and has a vision. Again, I don't want to give away too much. That for some reason struck me as a wonderful image of inspiration. And maybe it's just because it's I associate it with the stained glass of Chartres. I've always had this notion there's something mystical about the light pouring in through all that blue glass that's somehow indicative of the nature of how imagination works, how it receives while modulating inspiration from a different source. I'm just rambling now.
And in fact, the House of Apollo, doesn't it end with a dream? Isn't his last? Isn't
Yes.
the old priest's vision of Apollo? You give him the vision, as I remember it.
In a dream on his deathbed.
I found that a very, very moving story indeed, and also the True Helen, which again is a very interesting. I quite often dream my books. I dreamt Mr. Golightly woke me up. I was staying with I'd had quite a serious set of events happen in my life. My father had a stroke. My mother, who had Alzheimer's, had to go into home, and my marriage broke up very badly. And I took flight to an old friend who was living on that. During the night, the Saturday night, I had a dream that I was out on the moors, and this rather modestly dressed, middle-aged man turned up, and he explained to me who he was. And I woke up and realized that he was called Mr. Golightly, and I knew exactly what he was doing. He was coming back to rewrite a great work which he'd written many years ago. I'm going to spoil it for everybody because it doesn't really matter. It was such a long time ago. In fact, he's God, and I don't imagine that God actually wrote the Bible, by the way. So I'm playing around with ideas of God. But the upshot was I stayed with my poor friend a year while I wrote this book. So I was the woman who came to stay. I have very, very often had that experience of, in fact, when I write, when people sometimes say, how do you write? The answer is quite often with great difficulty. But in terms of practical things, I always get out of bed. I never look in the mirror, because if I look in the mirror, I start to see myself from the outside, and I have to stay on the inside. And I always stay in my nightdress. That's the only way I can write anything. And it's because I want to stay in that dreamlike experience. And your wonderful book, I mean, I think You Are Gods is your most radical book, actually. And I think it's wonderfully radical. And I so hope that people read it. But Roland in Moonlight was like, what was so marvelous about it was you conveyed the dreamlike state in which you are having this conversation with your psychopomp of a dog. A psychopomp, for those who don't know, being a creature who leads you into a higher dimension.
Quite often the realm of the dead, however, so I just want to point out he's not a psychopomp in that sense yet. But,
no, yeah. But it's a sense the realm of the dead, in the sense that the philosophies you have explained to you by your highly intelligent and subtle dog are, in a sense, coming from people who themselves have died and yet live on. I mean, this is one of the interesting layers of reality, isn't it? That those who've gone before us and have apparently died haven't died because they live on in their ideas and theories and thoughts and in our memories. So I absolutely responded to that book. It was a remarkable experience, and I perfectly understand how you may come to things in dreams. I've had many dreams that are not only introductions to my novels, but I remember during lockdown having a dream. I dreamt that I was in front of a lecture hall, and it was full of students. And I had come to give a lecture on the Iliad. And I had a particular theory about the Iliad, which was all to do with Priam and various things about Priam. And it doesn't matter what my theory was, because I asked the group of students if they knew the story of the Iliad, and only one or two people put up their hands. So I abandoned my lecture, and instead I told in my dream the whole story of the Iliad. And when I woke up, I thought, oh, what on earth is this dream about? Why am I dreaming about the Iliad? I went back to the Iliad. And of course, the Iliad starts with a plague. And the plague is because the Greeks have offended the priest of Apollo.
Right.
Apollo, who brings light, also brings plague.
He's also the god of pestilence, yeah. Yes.
And I thought this is the explanation of COVID. We've offended gods.
Well, I that works for me. It would.
And I think we have. I think we have. Gods, not God. The gods.
Well, especially if it should turn out that the origin of the virus lies in the way we twist and try to remake the natural order, not for the good, but simply as an exertion of the will, over the world around us, because there are mysteries about the origin of the virus. But whatever the case, it definitely emerges from some of the oddities of the way we live now, and I'm perfectly willing to see it as the bolts of Apollo descending on or the wrath of Elohim. I'm not trying to be partisan here, but yeah, no,
I
I
think my
think
point is that my preternatural intelligence made the connection with I'd completely forgotten, as one does, that that's how the Iliad starts, because one gets taken up with the whole issue of Achilles and Patroclus and Priam and the row with Agamemnon. I mean, I'd forgotten that it was
yeah,
it
it,
starts
it,
with a plague,
right,
and
right, and yeah,
and the plague is quite clear. We have offended the gods, and we're suffering. So that was an example, I think, of the way in which, in dreams, we widen our consciousness to take in other levels of understanding that are not available to our probably rather narrow conscious and intellects.
well, I concur. um, I suppose I know I should find some clever way of shifting to another topic, but I'm not a good interviewer. This is just a conversation, so I'm just going to do it abruptly.
Yes, be abrupt. It's
I'll
fine.
be abrupt. Um, well, actually, no, I don't want to be abrupt. I do. I want to go back to fairies for a moment.
Yeah, go back to fairies. We like
Um,
fairies.
yeah, well, I do like fairies. Yeah, and the fairy realm. When I was a child, actually, I was fascinated not only with the European myths, but with Native American uh, myths of the other world, or the other people, or the people below, who living in the Alleghenies. Uh, under the mountain, or in the deep forest, or and curiously enough, I mean, one running theme is a kind of antinomianism, but an
Mm,
antinomianism that's more like the innocence of nature than anything else.
mm,
It's not perversity or cruelty, even if it occasionally expresses itself that way. But mostly, it's
yeah.
an unfamiliarity with the division between good and evil. Um, but
Oh,
uh,
that's good. Mm.
but I, and again, risking the censure and the mockery of the virtual world out there. I also, when I was very young, had an experience that has left me ever since unable not to believe in nature spirits of some sense. And so this is my great confessional moment. I've never told this story before, but I feel I can tell it to you.
Please.
And at this point, if anyone's listening in, I just hope they'll be discreet. But it was in my late teens, 18, 19, I think it was, 18. Well, wait, I have to get this right, because I went to university early, so I would have been 17. It was my last year in high school. Winter, and I lived near a lake, actually an artificial lake, really, called Wild Lake, but it was at that time in Howard County, where I grew up. It was still a rather thickly forested, still largely rural county that's positioned between Baltimore and Washington. None of it exists anymore. It's all been overdeveloped. So if I actually did encounter any spirits of the woodland there, they've since been evicted, and I don't think there are any native spirits of housing developments. So, near Wild Lake, there was above it a rise in the woods where I often went with friends, and I was out late at night on my own in the early snowfall. It was really late autumn, moon bright night, full moon, and I went up the hill into a clearing in the woods, and there in the middle of it, in the snow, was a witch hazel tree. And I don't know if you've ever seen a witch hazel tree in blossom, but they blossom very late in the autumn and even linger on into the winter. So it's a very strange thing, and their blossoms are like these little golden tassels. But
Yep.
this tree was within, just a perfectly vertical shaft of the moonlight. The snow was glistening all around it, and the gold of the blossoms was remarkably vivid. It must have been 1 in the morning. I don't know. And I said something. I have no idea what I said. I said something to the tree. I don't remember what it was, but it was just a sort of casual, something like, well, you're looking dapper or something. Right? And I swear, and again, risking mockery. The tree began to tremble, the shake, the blossoms. It was about 10 feet from me, and there was laughter. And I wasn't drunk. I wasn't on drugs. And I may have been, and perhaps I was in a dream state, which doesn't mean that the experience wasn't perfectly real at the same time. But nonetheless, there was sort of this very clear laughter. And I looked around. I thought, could it be coming from the trees? And it was an illusion that it was coming from that tree. But then it happened again, and there was and the blossoms actually were trembling. There was no breeze. It was just the tree shook and laughed. And I ran like hell. I shouldn't have. I'd like to say that, it was a moment of just pure transport, and I came into close communion with the deep mystery at the heart of things.
I'll start again. Strangely enough, my two experiences are also with trees.
Ah,
When I was a very small child, there was a hawthorn tree. And I think it's interesting yours is a witch hazel and mine's a hawthorn, because they are magic trees. There's a hawthorn tree which I used to go and visit. And I used to go there when I was unhappy. And it was on the occasion, my parents were very good people, but they had an uncomfortable marriage. My mother was disabled, her legs were amputated. She was bombed in the war. My father was in a prisoner of war camp for a long time. And it was a pre-war marriage made in a hurry, and they stuck by it and had me. But it was one full of tension. And I used to escape from this to a hawthorn tree. And one day I was rather unhappy and I was crying. And the tree, it didn't actually speak out loud, but it spoke to my inner ear. So you could just say this is a child's imagination. But the tree spoke to me, and I can't tell you exactly what it said, but it spoke in this very sweet, soft, soothing voice. And I sat there for a moment, and then I was suddenly startled, and I swung down from the tree, and in this finger, I impaled myself on a thorn of the hawthorn.
okay.
And it's never gone away. And when I'm in trouble, it's got a little black lump inside my finger. When I'm in trouble, I touch it and it moves back and forward. That's one. The second is, not many years ago, I was in Western Australia on a book tour. And I used to go and stay at the invitation of some very lovely monks in a Benedictine monastery, where there was a very fine man who was abbot, whose name was Placid Spirit. Spirit was his true surname. Placid, of course, was the name he'd been given as a monk. And the very first time I went there, I walked down through, at twilight, down to a waterhole, because I was told there was a pleasant walk that I could take. And I stood beneath a tree, and into the tree there flew and settled a number of different parrots and parakeets. And as I stood under the tree, I was suddenly filled with the most terrible feeling of, you don't belong here. And I turned and fled back up the path to the monks. And I think that was a case of real panic. I think, I think, I think the spirit said, "This isn't your place. You don't." There is something about location, isn't there?
Yeah, oh
And
no, I think definitely one of the my earliest childhood. When I was well, I was born in a hospital in Baltimore, but the family lived in a place called Ellicott City, which has changed much over the years. But it was a small mill town that was built in this rather uncanny location among granite cliffs and forests and near a river that is famously uncanny. You know that there were many stories attached to the place, and the house I spent my earliest years in was across the road from a house that still enjoys the reputation of being the most haunted house in Maryland, a place called Lilburn, but to this day, I I don't know, maybe there's a lot of electromagnetism emanating from the granite, but there is something about that place that attracted both. Well, it had a reputation already, apparently, before the first colonists arrived, and retained it afterwards. And of course, there were always the stories about witches' covens and things like that.
mm,
It had the only thing I can think. I had that the parts of when Ellicott City. How can I put it? It reminded me in a minor way of visiting Avebury.
yeah,
Avebury is the actually most terrifying place I've ever
yeah,
been. People love to go to see Stonehenge and fantasize about the pagan world that produced it. But Stonehenge is a fairly late and I would say rather Apolline sort of structure compared to
yeah,
Avebury, which is a much more sublime and kind of elemental and terrifying. And yet I have a feeling there's something real here.
yeah.
It's not just let's put some big stones up here. It's not that. It is to my mind a genuinely terrifying place, and I've been maybe 3 or 4 times. Not living continuously in England. I haven't gotten there very often, and every time I get that same uncanny feeling, and I don't think it's just my imagination. I will say this: the area where I lived in my teens, well, from early boyhood through my early 20s in Howard County, that had been taken over by a town called Columbia that has now metastasized into just a sort of hideous, endless expanse of housing development, was at one time part of there were many native tribes and nations and confederacies, but in that area, specifically the home of the Susquehannock, who in 1652 were coerced into signing a treaty with the colony of Maryland, giving away their native lands. And Susquehannock myth is apparently, or the myth of the peoples of that is just full of the fairy lore, and much of it associated with trees. So I like to think that if I encountered any indigenous spirits that night, they had a long and noble history in that land, in that place. But I'm sure it was the place that was significant.
Yeah, there's a theory that a lot of the people who see these, whatever we want to call them, presences, are people whose families have lived on the land for a long time, and very often they've farmed the land.
Well, that would apply to my family. They
Yeah,
arrived in Maryland in 1635, and then proved to be the single most sedentary group of colonists in American history. They just didn't move again. So wow, got the Chesapeake, we've got crabs, we've got oysters, there's no need to go anywhere.
Well, the
So,
theory is they ate the produce of the land.
oh,
And the
the
land,
fairy fruit, like Lud in the
well,
Mist.
I think the natural produce is the fairy, and because it's the fairies' land, the fairy element through the produce gets into the blood of your ancestors. So this is probably why you have second sight. And by the way, about second sight, I wanted to ask you. I think it's first sight. I think second sight is what we learn to have.
Yeah.
I think
Oh, I'm very much a believer that consciousness is a convention quite often that has been bred in us from an early age, indoctrinated in us, and that if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see things very differently. But and even if I didn't believe that were true, I would make myself believe it because life is ever so much more interesting if it is true. But I honestly think that, yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that I was never. Well, have you know Owen Barfield's
of course,
writings? Yeah,
the great.
I really don't have. I really don't have to ask, do I? If it's something I like, it always seems, yeah. I can presume that you already know it well. But I think, despite certain differences with his account of things, I think he's absolutely right about how reality appears to us under which regimes of, if not representation, regimes of learned perception.
Of course, absolutely. I mean, I didn't know. I mean, I came to know Owen Barfield before I had, in my own naive way, thought that for myself.
Yeah.
That there is. I mean, I often I think in terms of Coleridge, actually, primary and secondary imagination, and he
Right.
said there is a primary imagination.
Right.
Secondary imagination is a second level. And so
Well,
it
that's
is consciousness. There's a primary consciousness where we are at one with all that's about us, whether it's apparently sentient or not. I mean, I would include rocks and stones, as well as rivers and streams and trees and air and so forth. Yes, so I've often, I go on about Barfield and more.
well, no, well, of course. I mean, one of his best books is What Coleridge Thought, which is really could have also been entitled What I Barfield Think.
Yes.
But it's also one of the best books on Coleridge and indirectly on the middle Schelling, of course, as well.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually been reading a lot of Schelling's nature philosophy
Yep.
again. Go back to it with, and of course, I think it's in Ideen zu einer Philosophie der Natur. I'm trying to remember which of the texts it is, but he has that wonderful phrase, that probably inverting the order here. Nature is visible spirit, spirit invisible nature. And that being so, in the communion between mind and world is something negotiated, so to speak.
I think that entirely. I mean, I think this is very important. As I'm always saying, to the boredom of my family, thought is real. Thought has an effect upon the world. And talking about, just to pick up on fairies again, I was thinking,
we could talk about fairies for hours. I'm agreeable.
Well, I do actually want to come on to your latest book, Kenagaya, because I'd like us to talk about that. So let's not forget that. But I was thinking, the UK is in a state of absolute, as Sean O'Casey would say, a state of chassis, or one of Sean O'Casey's characters.
Yeah.
The UK is in a state of chassis. These markets, the markets have determined that Liz Truss's, I'm sorry, this is rather boring and because it's a bit parochial. It's boring for your.
Oh no, actually we have been following just to distract us from our own rapidly
Yeah,
collapsing Republican
yes,
order. It's
yes, I can.
we're,
Shall we?
we're, we're, we're,
Shall we try to live?
I was
Yes.
about to say we're soon going to be broken into about 10,000 different city states. I think.
Well,
Running the full gamut from tyranny to anarchy.
well, just at the moment, count your blessings because you're in a better state than us. But I was thinking about the markets. The thing about the markets is they don't exist. They are
Right.
made up of an interwoven thoughts, guesses, predictions. They have no apparent reality. And yet, look at the effect they have. So what I want to say is, if you can believe in the markets, and apparently people do, why can't you believe in fairies? Or what about the Higgs boson, which has no, it's invisible,
Yeah.
doesn't, what I'm saying really is this limited notion of reality. You only have to look, whether you look at the markets or you look at particle physics. Why do we find it so difficult to accept that there are other invisible realms of being that do have an ontological effect, if not a substance? They create waves in the world in the same way that if you or I have an idea for a book or a story, and we write the story, and people read the story, the thing that begins in your mind or mine, or perhaps mind isn't the right place, whatever we want to call it, the place where things come from, in my case, it's sort of lumber room, moves into
The
the world.
foul rag and bone shop of the heart, I think, is so.
I don't think mine's a foul rag and bone shop. I think it's a
I
lumber.
know, but given your love of Yeats and your Yeatsian name, I'm just trying to throw in as much as I can. But yeah.
So, yeah, thought is real. It has an. I mean, when I was teaching Shakespeare, I used to have an interesting conversation with my students. Is Hamlet real? I would say. It seems to me Hamlet's in many ways realer than you or I, because Hamlet has existed much longer and has an impact on far more people. So this whole issue of reality needs. Well, I can't wait for your book actually, because I'm sure you're going to explore it in the
I
good
hope so. The funny
Bentley
thing,
Hart, acute, forensically intelligent way.
I'll tell you though, the format may come as a surprise. Well, I can't divulge that now because I have to wait until I've gotten over my editor's shock at it. So when she receives the completed manuscript, but well, I hope so. I'll say this: there's one problem with writing a book that's been delayed so long that you've thought of 10,000 more things to put in it
Yeah.
than you initially planned to put in it. So I'm trying not to exhaust. I think I found a way of communicating it without creating a 900-page tome that'll just sit on shelves in the back of Zoom conversations like this. I mean, Zoom conversations where one isn't lucky enough to have the illusion of a Japanese screen behind them.
Very pretty screen.
It is. I wish I could afford the real thing. This is just now a Zoom background at the moment that I took out of my collection of Japanese prints. But the original, I think, went at auction in Kyoto, or no, in Tokyo for, I'm told, something like 42 million or something. Well, I'm making that up, but some obscene amount, because it's
Children's books.
children's books. Yeah. Well, I mean, I
Because you see, I have yours here. Let me
it,
just not knock over my wine wheels.
oh, which wine are you drinking, by the way?
It's not wine, actually. It's a Campari and
Good.
soda.
Good, because the color just didn't look right at all, and I thought to myself, is that a Campari? And
It is a Campari. Now,
it is.
where is
Well, here, maybe I have a
Castle
copy.
Thriller.
No.
Where is
Oh,
Castle Thriller?
oh, that one I don't have a copy of.
I have it. Yeah. Where
Oh
is
well.
it? No, no, it is around somewhere. Where is it? Uh,
If you want, I can edit some of this out in the final cut, but on the other hand, I find it, again, charming. You know, this is a local color. Authenticity.
I had it
In
yesterday.
the moment. Yeah, you showed it to me yesterday when we talked. So I can, you know, I can edit in a picture of the cover.
Please edit in, because I know what I've done. I've taken it off to bed. Um,
Well, that's where it belongs, by the bedside. So,
what I wanted to say about Castle
Mac Gorilla.
Gorilla is I was so delighted by that because I and my younger son and my eldest grandchild have all had toys with whom we've had the kind of relationship that you and your son have with his toys that make up the book.
Right.
And one of the first things that my beloved granddaughter, my eldest grandchild, Rowan, I've got a book of hers in which, in very large cursive letters, she writes, "Toys are real, fairies are real, grown-ups are stupid."
Well, I mean,
sorry, grown-ups are silly. That's
silly, right? Well, oh, that's a sweeter way of putting it. No.
These are her three laws, and that book is so charming because throughout her childhood, she's now nearly 18 and she's an elegant young woman, but she won't mind because you can see some of the toys behind me. They live here now in my flat. She doesn't want to be rid of them, but so they've come to lodge with me. We always made up plays about them, and it's that celebration of childhood that is also very apparent in your beautiful story, which I have definitely got here, which I will now show up.
Oh yes.
But I think it informs your theology as well. I think it's got something of the same quality. In your theology, you're fierce and acerbic, but the spirit is very much the same. I mean, this is a beautiful story and beautifully written and very, very moving and has a lovely ending because I suppose I like it because it's a bit like my endings. It has a lovely ambiguity. It flows into uncertainty, out of certainty. I mean, it's the certainty of that world that Michael and Aurora have to escape from. It's the rigidity into the uncertain. And that, I think, is what I think C.S. Lewis it is, who says the thing about the fairy world is it's wild and disruptive. And he says something like it unsettles the self-satisfied certainty of the everyday world. There's some thread that runs through your theology into your fiction. I mean, I don't write theology, although I'm sometimes picked up as the theologian's novelist, which I'm always very flattered by. But I can feel the divine spark of the child comes through all of your work in different sort of aspects of the David Bentley Hart orchestra that you have within you.
Now I'm going to get choked up, but you know,
I'm going to make you cry. Good.
Yes, but it's so easy to make me cry. Notoriously lachrymose. You see, things now I don't know how to reply to that because I think it's true, but if I say it, it doesn't sound nearly.
No, you can because I've said it, so you can.
I don't have to. I can say, well, I can just say, well. It has been pointed out to me how often in theological and philosophical and literary critical. I also do, those right about it. How often I keep returning to claims about childlike wonder, and that children Platonic Aristotelian language about all being the source of philosophy is true, but I think it's more truly the case that it's not just wonder, it's childlike wonder.
Yeah, I
Because
agree.
because I only now vaguely remember it. I mean, I think that we all have an experience in early childhood that dims in memory as we grow older, that we can recall, but we can't recall the feel of it in quite the same way. Every now and again, we revert to it, a moment when
Yeah.
suddenly we're not asking a question about anything at all, and yet we're and for that reason, the question of everything poses itself to us. Just how extraordinary, just how uncanny, how wonderful the very there-ness of the world is, and the seeming contingency of it, and the strangeness, and everything familiar becomes momentarily strange. But I think that's just a sort of a fading echo of an experience we have in childhood, which is this natural capacity to take in the whole of reality as a source of delighted surprise and wonder. And the more we forget that, the sillier we become. Rowan was right, or stupider. We could use the harder word, and that the trick of not being a silly grown up to some degree is never to forget the initial wisdom of that. For the beauty of the infinite. I mentioned to you earlier that I love actually that quality of well, the great chain of being, the principle of plenitude, in that we're not confronted with two starkly opposed strata of reality,
Mhm.
the natural, which tends only towards death and dreariness, and the supernatural, which invades that world as something that in one sense redeems it, but in another sense
Mhm.
erases it. But instead that there is a real uh, in fact, even we're at the very category of the supernatural, as opposed to the natural, is very much a modern category up until
Absolutely. Yeah.
very late Middle Ages, where the term the supernaturalis appears, but then it only means in any given instance of a thing's nature that which is beyond it. So it is beyond a parrot to do long division sums, or beyond a cat, although according to Eliot, McCafferty does long division sums, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But that's all it means. As yet it hasn't become an ontological or a moral or God forbid a metaphysical division between a nature sealed in on itself as tending only towards a natural end, and that natural end being understood as something apart from and other than the grace and beauty and glory of spirit united to God, and then the supernatural, which is simply an entirely gracious superposition on that, or a superimposition on top of that. And the beauty of the infinite, for instance, was, just as the title gives away, an attempt to think back to a continuity between all the levels of it. My favorite, you mentioned C.S. Lewis. I have to say, my favorite book of C.S. Lewis is The Discarded Image.
Yes, it's a marvelous book, and particularly that whole chapter where he talks about this very subject we're discussing at the moment.
Uh, yeah, I think there are the Christian Platonist side of Lewis I very much like. Every once in a while, though, he felt he had to draw back. I always I have various feelings about his various books of fiction, and in That Hideous Strength, you have the character of Merlin, Ambrosius, brought back, but at the same time, C.S. Lewis feels he has to distance himself from certain aspects of the magical communion of this character with the natural world. He won't let him call up the spirits of nature to defend nature, because he sees in that something, that's the sort of the puritanical side of the Northern Irish Protestant side of C.S. Lewis. He feels he has to distance himself from that, because there has to be a hard and fast line drawn between the pagan sensibility and the Christian. That is also an artifact of modernity to some degree. The early Christians may have been somewhat too peremptory in their in their dealings with the daimonian realm, but they didn't actually depopulate the spheres or evacuate nature of its spiritual presences. They may have been increasingly censorious of those presences.
I think they were jealous.
Maybe so. But the funny thing is, there was a long history. Even in Jewish Second Temple Judaism, but also Jewish and early Christian tradition, emphasizing that there are angels of the weather, angels of nature, angels, that the angelic realm was not something different from, was not qualitatively other than the realm of daimones in late antique cosmology. It simply seemed to be rival orders, Well, no, it's Uriel who deals with fire. Okay.
Uriel is fire,
not
land, air, and water, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm rambling again.
No, rambling is what we're doing.
Rambling is good. Rambling is
very, very good. It's Ian, of course, McGilchrist would say this is due to the left hemispheric perception having become dominant, splitting up the world into partitions in order to grasp it, and we have become rampant left hemispheric in our culture, and I think there's a lot in that.
Yeah, I think actually
cultures feed the imagination, so the imagination itself becomes more and more limited. And what I was going to say is, just because I do want us to talk about children's literature, is that what seems to have happened is that, with one or two exceptions, of whom I am one, actually, in terms of reasonably accepted novelists, only children's authors can write about an enchanted world. It's fairly unusual. And, you can get an awful lot of flack if you write about an enchanted world where spirits and angels and gods and so forth are recognized traditional presences. It's become only acceptable in children's literature. And it's as though children, when they get to the age of puberty, suddenly have to shut the door and move into this very materialist and dead sort of a world. I mean,
I think, and of course it's well, of course, this is an interesting thing. I was reading an essay by Clive James, in which he said, well, no serious writer should really have much patience for writing about the magical, and
that's very typical Clive James.
Yeah. The funny thing I was thinking, and of unseen presences and all that, I was just thinking, that precludes 98% of the world's literature up until modernity. I mean, naturalist narrative is actually not that natural a behavior, and even then, I mean, what was funny is this was I think he said this in relation. He was well. It was Anthony Pohl that he was talking about. Dance to the Music of Time. Not one of my favorite writers, but a lovely prose style of a sort of costive but precise variety. But anyway, but he was also talking about Proust, and I thought, this is peculiar. Okay, I suppose Proust is a naturalist in the sense that he doesn't directly but there's no more fairy tale like, especially the first two volumes of Valouchèche de Pompidou. I mean, Cambrai is not a real place in the French countryside, nor is Bolbec. I mean, these are realms of fairy, but he seemed to, he was just being very and then it occurred to me, that there's an act of cultural betrayal here.
Yeah.
Because Clive James is Australian, and I don't care what anyone else says, the single greatest work of Australian literature is Patrick White's Riders in the Chariot.
Yeah.
Which is yeah. Even its flaws are great, even its flaws seem larger and more mysterious and more majestic than most books' virtues. So and it struck me that curiously enough, I mean, if you remember, some of the most effective parts of that book are, I can't remember, it's been so long, the main female character, the one who's ungainly and groping the is describing describing her childhood and the fact that in a sense, right, in a sense, she remains fixed in a kind of childlike innocence throughout the book, and this is precisely why she's one of the riders in the chariot, why she has seen the Merkava of God. Yep. So anyway, but it is sad that I mean, you told me actually that I don't want to embarrass anyone you work with. Just say this, that the fairy presence in The Gardener was not necessarily what those responsible for promoting the novel necessarily wanted to call attention to.
They wanted to suppress it. I mean, I'm known for my psychological, I think, accuracy. And there are two sisters in the book, and their relationship is well done. But it wasn't for me the important part of the book. It wasn't for me the interesting part of the book. I mean, I liked the two sisters. I enjoyed writing them, and I liked the other characters. But that wasn't the heart of the book. And when I was at a so-called marketing meeting, where I went with my extremely good agent, and I suggested that there was a dimension in the book which we needn't spell out, but was rather magical. They were horrified, and they said, no. What's important is the garden and horticulture and people getting over lockdown by gardening, all of which was perfectly true. But it wasn't the point. And it's because, and I noticed that in the reviews, which were, actually, I think they were uniformly good, nobody mentioned the fairy element. Nobody mentioned that element. And in previous novels, I've had some quite nasty reviews because people are either frightened or embarrassed. And I write well. I know I write well. I do not write whimsy. It's not sentimental. It's not trash. Oh. It's well written, good English. But the subject matter of anything that isn't so, you see, there's a confusion, I think, at the moment between naturalism and realism.
Right.
Naturalism is the representation of the quotidian world as we actually see it and experience it in our everyday consciousness. But that isn't realism. The Riders in the Chariot is a wonderfully realistic book. A Midsummer Night's Dream is wonderfully realistic. There is realism. Well,
Oh,
I'm preaching to the
I
converted.
was about to say that's my Bible. That and the Wind in the Willows, and
The Wind in the Willows, Alice in Wonderland.
yeah.
I mean,
Well, if you mention
but
Lewis Carroll, you'll just render me unable to speak because of the tide of emotions. My devotion to Lewis Carroll is probably infinite. If you know,
and I noticed in one of your recent Substacks, you refer to a couple of books that are great favorites of mine, one of which is probably along with Alice and her adventures through the Looking Glass. Alice and Through the Looking Glass and What She Found There, I should say.
right.
Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pierce, which is a book that absolutely transformed my childhood because it explores through consciousness of a boy the whole mystery of time, the way
Yeah.
time isn't linear, um, which is another thing which I think flows through my fiction and indeed your writing, the mystery of time, the
It's
way in
that.
which although we live apparently in a linear way, our memories, our recollections, the way in which when I worked as an analyst, I would watch a person's whole past change as their attitude towards their past changed. So let nobody tell me that history is history. It isn't.
Well, you see, not only do I agree with this, I insist on it. That this is a recurrent theme. It's true in odd ways in my book about the past being constituted in the future or in the present, and being reconstituted and changed, really, literally changed.
Exactly.
And, and even the book recently on tradition and apocalypse, although that theme apparently didn't quite resonate with some of my Thomist readers, I have a very I have a very vexed relationship with traditional Thomists, but only because they're evil. Otherwise, there's nothing between us except love and amity. But there's, I do recall, I always thought that one of the, assuming that in quantum mechanics that the Everettian multiple
Yeah.
universes are not real, or are, it doesn't matter how you see it. Nonetheless, one of the interesting things about the double slit experiment that always to me I always thought had implications far beyond the level of the quantum was that at the moment of observation or of measurement, when either really or apparently the wave function collapses into a particle, the entire past history of that particle comes into being.
Exactly.
It's
Yep.
before observation, the particle passes or wave passes through both slits and neither and one and the other. All right. And if the observation occurs between the slits and, say, the photosensitive surface that records, not only do you no longer get the wave function from that point onward, but from that now the particle has a history. It did pass through one slit or the other. And it just seems to me that if that's true at the level of the quantum realm, I see no reason to assume that consciousness is not always in the act of poetically reconstituting the past, and that this is why we're capable of spiritual healing and redemption and becoming other than just what we were, and what we were determined to be by the past. But yeah, no, I'm very much a believer that time is far more fluid and non-local than common sense would tell us it is, especially in the mechanized picture of reality.
I had many experiences when I was working as an analyst. I remember once in particular, there was somebody who came to see me for a long time. She came from Australia to get away from her mother. And she'd had a very difficult relationship with her mother and a very, very negative view of her history with her mother. And then one day, as can happen, I mean, I think there were signs of it beforehand, but to shorten the story, one day she had a sort of breakthrough. She had this memory of the mother that in her recollections had been uniformly cold, distant, unyielding, unsympathetic, of her mother giving her a bracelet and putting it round her wrist and then kissing her on the forehead. And it came up through a series of associations she had with the dream. And she sat in my room and she started to cry over this. And the next day I had a phone call from her, and she said, when I got home, there was a message from my mother on the answer phone, and she and her mother had not spoken for years. So this is not the only example I have, it's just one that happens to come to mind. You can say that's a coincidence, but I would say thought is real, that something happened. And as very often happens, and it's something I do use in my books, it's when somebody is emotionally open. They may be grieving, they may be frightened, or they may be in love, or they may be looking at a beautiful painting, but something opens and it affects other realities, other people, other realities, the world about them. I mean, I've had so many examples of it.
You know, it's funny. I mean, I think we've all. Well, I mean, just gosh. I mean, the experience of synchronicity. You know,
Yeah.
actually, you and I believe, have had a
Yes.
few. Just, I mean, this seems unimportant, but at times it mounts up to a reserve of evidence that's far more than trivial. It happens again and again and again. I mentioned my nephew earlier, and you know, out of nowhere, it just occurred to me. I don't even remember what the book was. Oh, I do. Yeah, I thought I had an extra copy of a critical edition of Hyperion, of Hodanin's Hyperion, and I thought maybe he would like it. And I wrote to him only to get back, that's very bizarre, because just a moment ago I suddenly thought how much I'd like a copy of Hyperion. And
Yeah.
you know, now these are small things, and yet you know, it's simply too frequent for me to be able to think that thought is simply a specific set of electrochemical impulses and neural and neuronal activities sealed within a skull, because it just seems to me it's not. It seems to me much more the case that we're participating at large
Mm-hmm.
in a community of spirit, that and we're not sealed off from one another. You know, you mentioned actually Ian McGill, Chris. Well, that's an interesting question: left brain, right brain. The question is the agency, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
what he's not saying is that the left brain is a self and the right brain is a self, and one is so. It's
No.
literally that there is an agency of consciousness that can more either elect or be elected to function through the sort of conventions, habits, equipment, so to speak, of one hemisphere or the other. That the brain then looks very much like an instrument of consciousness, not for just that reason. That, and you know, I think we know this from other experiences as well. But I don't want to go. I'm going to start sounding a little bit too new age for my own taste if I go on, so I'll avoid it. But it's an interesting. I think it's an interesting question. That I believe also that it's clearly the case that there is an agency of consciousness, both prior to and greater than what's occurring within us as isolated psychological individuals attached to a certain specific set of certain specific network of neurology. And that when you say consciousness is real, consciousness is as much an element in which we live and move and have our being
It's
as
an
it is something we
interaction, isn't
do.
it? I mean,
Yeah,
my image that I put to Ian was that it's an Aeolian harp.
yeah.
That the brain is our consciousness is an Aeolian harp, and on it blows the wind or the spirit from which
Or
the
the
music.
breath. Yeah.
But the breath, indeed. Um, but it's this whole notion of the exchange, of the dialogue, of the reciprocity that's essential. And as you know, one of the stories that I use in one of my books, The Other Side of You, one of the biblical stories that I'm very, very fond of, and I'm nearly always very fond of the stories that artists like to paint. It's the story of the road to Emmaus, when the two disciples are walking and suddenly this third presence emerges between them. And I mean, it's a wonderful story about how out of two engagements emerges a higher possibility.
It's it's strange. I mean, that particular story always, when I was a child, was actually my favorite gospel story. Precisely.
Yes, me too.
Um, well, it's unlike all the others in one sense. I mean, in all the other, the resurrection narratives are among the most lyrical and beautiful moments in the Gospels, quite often, at least, especially in Luke and John. In John, you have that the 21st chapter, which I very much believe is a somewhat later addition to the text. I think the clear signs has such a dreamlike quality to it.
Yeah.
Because uh, because it happens as if actually a friend of yours, Rowan Williams, wrote about this brilliantly years ago in his book Resurrection.
Yeah, it's one of his great books, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah,
Mm.
it's as if it's all starting over again, in a sense, as
Yeah,
if all the past has not been. Once again,
yeah,
he's calling them from their boats. At first, he's a stranger, but then they know him.
yes,
And he undoes the past because he's talking to Peter, of course, and Peter had, as he had been told he would do, he had denied Christ 3 times before the crowing of the cock. And then Christ asks him 3 times. And again, Rowan's great about this because he points out a little detail that might have eluded notice otherwise, is that both in that scene on the beach and in the courtyard of the house of Caiaphas, Peter is standing over an anthrakia, a coal fire.
yeah,
So the little detail with
yes.
extreme artistry links the two scenes.
That's a
He
very
allows
good.
Peter to undo the past
Yes,
by 3 times professing his love, both agape and philia, for Christ.
one of
And
the things I've. Sorry, go on. You haven't finished. Sorry.
no, but I was again, and the story also of the road to Emmaus again has that dreamlike quality. Is that it's not simply, oh well, look, he's back like Elvis. I knew he wasn't really gone. Something has changed. I mean, now he's also the stranger who encounters us on the way, and in a sense, every stranger that encounters us on the way, a presence that's with us even when we don't see it, you know.
I
But
think
also
that.
the last thing I'll say is that of course remember how often you hear tales of people in extreme distress in a party always imagining that there was another there
Yeah,
who they all remember being there, but they can't say who it was because he's supernumerary, literally. He's outside the number of the party. Shackleton, I think, tells a story like that.
That's the title of the book in which this story becomes very important, is The Other Side of You, which comes from
Right.
the T.S. Eliot line, which is a quotation of Shackleton finding the being on the other side. The bit I love almost most in it
That
is,
was a setup, by the way, I want to point out. The Other Side of You is one of Sally's novels. Go on. I thought it was very clever of me, but now I have to call attention to it because I'm an egoist.
no, yeah, I'm grateful to you. The bit I love most, I think, in that story, which is a remarkable story and doesn't appear anywhere else in any of the other Gospels, is that you can tell at the end he wants to go on and he doesn't. They keep him back. They want him to come and have supper. They don't know why they want this stranger to come and have supper with them, but it's because he's lifted their spirits as they walk. But he would have gone on. You will know, I've got your New Testament here somewhere, in case we needed to look it up. But you will know better what
Second edition coming out in March for those who are just eager to spend more money on things.
In case people think I'm lying.
There you
go. Rather beautifully reviewed in the Literary Review in English.
Yes, I recall. Yes, well, yes, reviewed.
Well, we didn't know each other then. I should explain to your audience that this is not sycophancy. I got to know David through doing a review of the New Testament, of his New Testament, his excellent New Testament. Yes, it's that he would have gone on. I don't know. You may disabuse me, although I hope you won't. My sense has always been that a part of him, a little like the D.H. Lawrence story, The Man Who Died, doesn't want to come back, but he stays because they urge him to sit and eat, and as with the Peter story, repeat the occasion of the Last Supper.
No, I love that. No, oh yeah, no. I mean, it's actually again, and I keep returning to the theme. It's the dreamlikeness of it that I find most convincing, because somehow I think it captures, a real experience that was part of the early Christian community's experience of resurrection, or however they would understand the risenness of Christ. That there was a real experience of living presence, which I find utterly convincing. It's a funny thing. I mean, I'm not a person who easily adopts specific beliefs about things. I do have not a part of myself that I'm either proud of or sorry about. It's just that there is an aspect of me that it will simply my first impulse is to say that's a story someone made up, or it's symbolic of something else. It's only when I confront something that has a kind of power like that seems to me to exceed the possibility of simple invention. That is, I think it's an inspired story. I don't necessarily believe it's a literal account that was just copied out, but that makes the experience of the early Christians credible to me. It's also like Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 when he talks about the witnesses of the risen Christ. There is something there that I find utterly convincing. It's also utterly unclear how Paul, even though he then goes into a long discourse on the nature of resurrection bodies, it's clear that that even then you can read Paul in any number of ways. He does not actually give you a specific dogma of what resurrection is. And for that very reason, the power of the stories he's telling seems absolutely credible to me. I find it impossible not to think that I'm glimpsing a real experience that actually could only be conveyed maybe in this dreamlike parable or story, but that nonetheless is absolutely real and realist in the correct sense, you know. I may not be expressing that with particular clarity, but that's all right. I mean,
I think one of my measures for, I mean, one of the reasons I often take old stories as a kind of blueprint or framework for my stories. I mean, most of the time, my stories are set in the more or less present, more or less present. My story about Freud is obviously set in the 1930s, but that takes the story of Oedipus, and The Other Side of You takes the Emmaus story, and Miss Garnett's Angel takes Tobias and the Angel story. Is very often these are stories, as I said, that have appealed to other artists. And I mean, one of the measures, I think, of the truth of a story is if it survives time, if it
yeah.
if it continues to evoke a response in audiences in different cultures. I mean, and the fact is, the story of Tobias and the Angel, which is probably a Persian story in absolute origin, or even probably a Median story mixed with elements of Judaism, has continued to affect artists throughout history, as you can see from the many times it's represented in paintings. You get it in music, you get it in fiction, not only mine. The road to Emmaus, the supper at Emmaus, is another such. So even if it doesn't have it, one isn't simply relying on the effect it has on one's individual self. It has a whole cultural tradition behind it, which means it carries what I call eternal verities. And these are eternal verities contained within a story, which transcend individual cultures. They seem to pass through all kinds of stages of civilization in a way that, you know, a great deal of modern fiction isn't going to. Very, you know, not much survives, but certain quintessential truths do survive, whether they're paintings or they're dances or they're music, or, but it's very often a story that will do it. And that is why I'm inclined to believe that story. I mean, I agree with you. I don't think it's a literal truth, but it's something
Right.
about the way a higher reality emerges out of a certain kind of attitude. That's that's what the resurrection was with those two disciples. You know, what the resurrection for them was, this presence that arises between them, and also in the act of sitting down and eating a meal, which is such a brilliant image. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
it's Abraham and Sarah welcoming in the three angels. It's
Well,
Jesus' Last Supper. This it's hospitable, and I always think hospitality is one of the features.
yeah, I
Of
can't help regretting myself that again I risk criticism for this, but I can't help regretting actually that the Eucharist isn't still as it was for the first generations of Christians, an
yeah,
actual
love.
sitting down at table together, the
Yeah,
agape
yeah.
feast. But you know, it's kind of hard to do that with 1.2 billion Catholics at a time or whatever. You know? um,
But
I
it's a marvelous. I don't want to say image. It's a marvelous example. You know, the fact that he chose to communicate his last message when he was alive at a meal, and then comes back and there's another, and there are two other meals. It does seem rather
oh,
important. You can
oh yeah.
see why eating and drinking have got in, have got into the DNA of the whole religious principle.
Well, yeah, in a sense, I remember once, I can't remember, it wasn't me, it was a friend of mine who had asked Alexander Schmemann, the Orthodox theologian, Russian Parisian, New York, and in one of his most famous books, For the Life of the World, begins with a chapter, a meditation on eating. You are what you eat,
Yeah, yeah.
But he was someone asked him what the essence of religious experience was, and he said, food.
Hmm.
Now, and this is true. I mean, you find it's not just in the Christian world that the act of sitting down at table together, also feeding those before you. I mean, most religious cultures have a sacrifice culture that goes back originally, almost certainly, to feeding your ancestors, keeping them well housed, making sure that they're looked after. Good filial piety. But the act of sitting down together at table is the place where you acknowledge. Well, I suppose two things. One is your frailty, your dependency, just like everyone else, on the stuff of life, and also where you acknowledge that you are one among others. The rule of community is, and one way or another, this in like the elders of Israel eating before the presence of Yahweh on Sinai, or the gods coming to the wedding of Cadmus and Harmony, or whatever. The feast is the place,
Yes.
where the divine and the human, where the mortal and the immortal.
And it's
So
experiential.
often, yeah,
It's experiential and it's embodied. So it's not theoretical. It's
right,
something that we actually take in
and have to
um,
take in.
and have to take in to survive.
So should we? I just realized that your friend Naaman, or is it Naaman or Naaman?
No, man.
Yes, I would think so, but who knows? Everyone anglicizes their names in this country, so it's possible. Um, is
Naman
is
is actually in India, and he's probably just
yes?
it's on and has
We
I
we've
hope gone to bed.
I hope so. But maybe we should stop for now. I think we've agreed
Yes,
to talk again,
yes.
but it's been over 2 hours, so I'm afraid that somewhere out there he might actually be clinging on and keeping awake out of a feeling of
Well, I hope so.
responsibility. I hope not. It's
Please
lovely.
please feel free to edit this in any way you like, David.
I'll
Anyway,
cut out all of your comments and just leave mine in place, huh? Except for the ones where you're praising things I've written.
you can see me simpering and
Yeah, yeah. Make it seem like this was nothing but you desperately needing to tell me that you like things.
I
Um,
do. I do.
but no, it's lovely actually to see you. Most of our communications by email, and though this isn't really face to face in the best sense, nonetheless, it's much more pleasant than just exchanging emails. Although some of the emails are very clever, by the way, I have to say.
Um, one thing I wanted to just say, and we might just do another conversation and fit it in at some point, is I'm interested in what you actually think a fairy tale is, because fairy tales have a very wide remit, don't they?
They do. Um, yeah,
I
that's
mean, this doesn't actually have fairies in it, but it's a fairy tale,
this is true.
isn't
But
it? I
it
mean, I would
is.
call it a fairy tale.
Yeah, but the realm of fairy, in a sense, there is precisely what's been excluded from the
Exactly.
world in which, right.
You know, no, but I think we should have said a bit more about that. But I want to
I'm
say,
more than happy to talk about fairy tales, and fairy tales I've written. A fairy tale, yes. But so yeah, let's agree to talk about that explicitly in particular next time.
should we do that?
Yes,
Actually, talk
I
about
would very
fairy
much like
tales
that.
and take some children's books as well,
Yeah,
because
no,
we've really
well, I'd
rather
love that.
widely. I
Yes,
didn't
yes.
really mean I didn't really mean to get into theology, but somehow I wandered in via my own books into
Well,
biblical.
there's quite a lot of theology in your books, whether it's intended to be read as theology or not. You are right. You are a novelist that theologians read.
It's not
Again,
meant as, it's not meant as theology. It's simply that
well, but it's a
it's how
vision.
I see the world.
But
It's
the way you see the world, or the way one sees the world through your books, I think appeals to the theological, or a certain kind of theological imagination. I know other kinds of theological imagination that are extraordinarily sterile and would find
mm,
actually the world you depict as something almost obscene in its
yeah.
pagan exuberances and its tolerances and other things. But for a healthy theological imagination, I think in your books, one's glimpsing what many of us take to be a realer reality than the one that the conventions of modern thought and modern prejudice and 4 centuries of metaphysical mechanism or mechanistic metaphysics have taught us to believe as reality. So it's not a surprise that we, I'll put myself in the, I don't like calling myself a theologian, but that we're drawn to them. So yes, I'll talk about fairy tales next time, since we've been talking for more than 2 hours.
Yes.
And I feel that there's
Good
some
job.
poor fellow out there in India
Yes.
who out of
Yes.
loyalty and kindness,
Yes.
is awake making the recording for you. That
I
we
hope
sh-
he's not. I hope he's sensibly just left it on for us. But if you're
I
still
hope so.
there, Naman, lots of love, and I hope to see you soon here.
And many
He's
thanks.
he, he's he's invaluable to me. I have to kidnap him from
Right.
poor parents.
Yeah, well, good. Yeah, that's the way to do it. Anyway, it is lovely to talk to you. It's lovely to see you.
It's lovely to see you, David,
I
and
look forward
stay
to
in touch.
resuming. And
Yes,
well, we seem to exchange emails every other day or so. So I imagine we'll be in touch. But I
sure.
will resume the conversation, and
Yeah, yeah.
I'll be over in England sometime in the spring. So
Good,
I'll
good, good.
come and raid your larder for
We'll go
purely
to Avebury.
sacred reasons.
We can go to Avebury.
Yes, and feel numinous terror. That's
Yeah,
always
yeah,
always a jolly way to
yes.
spend time together with friends. Yeah. All right. Well,
Okay,
take care. Goodbye.
bye.